going on, people? Welcome to United View and welcome to the Tactical View. On today's show, we'll be taking a detailed look at what happened in the game against Fulham, but also a little bit more generally at the way this team's progressing under Erik ten Hag. We'll be looking at some of the system changes we've seen in recent weeks and how ten Hag might look to take this team forward after the international break. So, without any further ado, let's get into the show. Now, on paper, that Fulham game yesterday might not seem the most tactical of battles because, let's be honest, it was all over within a 5-minute spell of complete madness from the Fulham, not just players, the Fulham backroom staff as well. All sorts of stuff going on. Marco Silva throwing water bottles, losing his head. Mitrovic trying to assault the referee. All sorts of strange stuff going on. So, yeah, on paper, maybe not the most tactical of games, but actually, when you delve a little bit deeper below the surface, there's a lot of reasons why United weren't as good as we can be, and also why the sort of form we've seen in recent weeks where, let's be honest, for maybe 3-4 weeks now, United haven't really played too well. Actually, there's a big tactical reason behind that, and that's the way that ten Hag set this team up, which is what he's done to make us good when we're at our best, but it means that when we're at our worst, we look even worse than we otherwise would do, and we're even more exposed. So, as we tend to start these shows, we'll take a quick look at the Fulham team, and on paper, I know they're doing well in the Premier League this season, but there's not too many players there that you look at and think, wow, what a player. Andreas Pereira coming back to Old Trafford, it was nice to see him back. He's much the same as he always is in terms of a fantastic runner, a little bit less quality on the ball, but he had a lot of space to work with, which we gave him, so he looked all right yesterday. Mitrovic, of course, you know he's going to be a handful. Unfortunately, he was a handful too much, not just for the United players, but also for the referee, hence he got sent off. So that's him. Palhinha was exceptional, got man of the match yesterday. I think certain aspects of the way Palhinha plays, again, were more suited to the way United defended yesterday than you'd find against other teams. I find with Palhinha, he's not maybe the best passer in the world, but in terms of carrying the ball, getting up the pitch by literally with the ball at his feet, he's not so bad. Defensively, he's fantastic. He's an all right ball carrier, but yeah, if you put him into a situation where he has to sort of dictate the play and sort of the main job is passing, he struggles. But if you put him in situations where there's a bit of open space and actually if he commits a player, gets past them, he can drive forward, then he'll look exceptional like he did yesterday. I think defensively, Anthony Robinson actually really impressed me with some of the sprints he was making, his athletic ability, and I think, to be honest, that was in stark contrast to what you saw from United players. When there was space out wide, when United were able to switch the ball into opposite areas, there was absolutely no willingness from pretty much anyone, even including someone like Marcus Rashford, to just get your head down and run forwards as quick as you can, whereas the Fulham players were doing it. And that really is the impact of the congested fixture schedule that we've had in recent weeks. And that's one of the reasons why right now United are in a little bit of a tough place and the international break comes at the perfect time. The last player I want to highlight here actually is Tim Ream. I think his left foot and the way he allows Fulham to play out of pressure is really, really helpful. And again, that exposed some of the things United were trying to do in the press. So I'll bring up now the board for both teams as well, so we can have a little look at how the teams matched up, what was going on there. But really, what was interesting was that for another game, as we've seen far too much in recent times, United were unable to play well with the ball, not playing great without the ball, and let's be honest, we were hanging on for a long time and we were lucky that it was only 1-0 when all the madness happened. I think, to be fair, either way, even if it's 2 or 3, when playing against 9 men, you should be able to score, but it was a tough game because United have been really poor recently. Now, the main reason United have been poor is that with the absence of Christian Eriksen in midfield, so I'll highlight this area here, with the absence of Christian Eriksen there, what United have had to do is find a different way to progress the ball, because what we've had before with Eriksen in that area is someone that you know can take the ball on the half turn and with 1 or 2 touches they can find the passes to the forward players. In that 4-2-3-1 you're looking for the front 4 in front. You've got the wingers either side, striker and the number 10. With Eriksen you can trust that he can find one of these players. Now, it can sometimes be quite difficult from this area to progress the ball forward because you do only have 4 targets ahead of the ball. You've only got the wingers who oftentimes, if you're playing against a team that sit back in their defensive shape in a low block, you'll have the opposition wingers sort of screening in front of the wingers and you've got the fullbacks sort of pressing behind. So finding the wingers in that sort of situation can be quite difficult unless you're a really good technical player, which is part of the reason why United have struggled so much to progress the ball without Christian Eriksen there. And what that's done, what that's meant, is that Ten Hag's had to change the system, change the way we go about doing things. And what you see instead, rather than having a double pivot here, what we saw yesterday and what we've seen a little bit more recently is we've actually just had a single pivot. So yesterday it was McTominay sitting deeper, Sabitzer fairly high on the left, Bruno Fernandes higher on the right, and that changes the role of the wingers. But before we go into the wingers, I want to have a little bit more detailed look at Sabitzer. So what we've got here, you can see his heat map. what you'd expect from Christian Eriksen when he's played in that role is nothing like this. You can see how heavily based on that left wing he is. It's almost like he's on the touchline half the time. That is much more similar to what the sort of heat map that you'd expect for a winger, not really what you'd expect from a central midfield player. And what you could see as well in game a lot of the time was that he was so often when you saw maybe Luke Shaw on the ball, or you see Jadon Sancho looking to tuck in, or actually Martinez is the perfect example. When you see Martinez on the ball, rather than Sabitzer staying inside in a midfield position, he's getting really, really wide. And that's one of the dynamics where United haven't really worked it out as yet. So if we head back to the ball, what we can see is, let's say Martinez is on the ball here. What will then tend to happen is the Fulham shape out of possession was more of a 4-4-2. Sometimes Pereira will be screening McTominay, but at other times he'd push on and join sort of Mitrovic in a front two there, opposite the centre-backs. Now, this is where it's so important that we've got someone like Martinez, because you need someone who's able to take the ball under that sort of pressure, not lose it, but also be able to find the passes forwards. And what you were seeing often was Sabitzer getting really wide out here, maybe Luke Shaw staying a little bit narrower so you can find those combinations. But whereas with a 4-2-3-1, what we've tended to see is if we're trying to play out from wider areas, we'll see the winger dropping in to help out and combine with the fullback. No. Instead, now with the single pivot, what we're seeing is the winger stays really high, keeping the defensive line nice and deep on either side. And then instead, you've got the 8 on that side. So it's Sabitzer on the left yesterday, Bruno on the right most of the time, but they're the ones dropping in to combine with the fullback. Now, that means that if we can't retain the ball, it's a donut formation in midfield because you've got no one there. It's a big hole in the middle of the pitch because Scott McTominay is not doing anything. So it's a situation where, because we haven't been able to progress the ball as well without Christian Eriksen, we've had to change the system. Changing the system now means that if you've got McTominay in there rather than Casemiro, you've got nothing in the middle of the pitch. So if you do lose the ball in these areas, your 8 is already out of position. The other 8 is high up the pitch on the opposite side. So it's just McTominay trying to defend that entire area, which means it is really difficult for him to do. So in a lot of senses, actually, we're causing ourselves our own problems whilst we've got the ball. So it's a system change from Ten Hag to try and get around some of the weaknesses we've got with personnel missing. But actually, what it's ended up doing in some ways is, yes, it gives us another target ahead of the ball to try and progress play forward. So if one of these back four or McTominay pick up the ball, rather than just having the front four ahead, and as we've said, the wingers in that situation are typically marked by the opposition winger in front and the fullback behind, so it's difficult to receive the ball. Now, having the extra target in front means that the opposition winger can't necessarily... If Willian's here in this situation, he can't necessarily just sit in front of Sancho. He's actually got to worry about Bruno Fernandes. So he's got to come a little bit narrower. And just having that one extra player ahead of the ball gives you that many more options, makes it that much easier to progress the ball. But obviously, as we've said, there is that weakness that if you lose the ball, because you've got more players high up the pitch, you are exposed in the centre. So pretty much everything tactically in football, especially when you're talking about numerical advantages where you've got the extra player. If you've got it in one area of the pitch, you haven't got it somewhere else, which means that if you lose the ball, you can be vulnerable. So it's always trade-offs, it's always balances, but at the moment, that's where Ten Hag sees this team going, and I think that's the solution he's got at the minute. I think as soon as Christian Eriksen's back, we'll be back into a more familiar 4-2-3-1 with the wingers playing their normal roles. So, as we mentioned there, in terms of, we've sort of talked about what we see in the middle third, we want to talk now about what we see in the final third with the wingers. So, it's a different sort of system, a different sort of role for them from what they were doing previously. So in the 4-2-3-1, what you'd see is the wingers would be quite often combining with the fullbacks getting a little bit higher when we're playing through the wings, through the wide areas. But now, with the 8s coming wider, the wingers have got to stay really high. And if the 8s, especially if they're the 8s aren't just staying high, but they're going into the wide spaces as well, it lets the wingers tuck in. But the dynamics for that aren't really set up yet. It's not really sorted perfectly in the way that maybe previously in the 4-2-3-1, Shaw knew what Rashford was going to do before he received the ball. Rashford knew what Luke Shaw was going to do. They knew what Eriksen was going to do on that left side, and they knew how Bruno would sometimes come in, sometimes not. Sometimes Weghorst might come in, sometimes he'd stay out front, and similar with Martial. Where now, a lot of things have changed to the point where the relationships aren't quite as sort of settled, they aren't quite as stable. Players can't predict each other's movements quite as well as they normally can, which means that the fluidity is just not quite there in the same way. So what we saw yesterday quite often was Jadon Sancho coming out to this side instead. And with Sabitzer playing really wide, that allows Sancho, rather than having to worry about holding the width, he can then tuck into these areas. And to be fair to him, he created a fair few chances, caused a lot of threat. And I think all 3 goals were Sancho involvements. And he had a lot of pretty much everything good that United did, which admittedly probably wasn't as much as we would have wanted, but everything basically came through Jadon Sancho. So I think that dynamic on the left side there, with Sabitzer coming wide, Sancho tucking in, I think it works. For Rashford though, I don't think it does, because all it does, if you put Rashford onto the last line, whereas in previous situations he's receiving the ball in one-on-one situations, if you put Rashford into this sort of position, he's always surrounded by 2 or 3 players, and at the moment, when he's in peak physical condition, at his best, you can see he can bounce, at this point now, he's got stronger, he can bounce 2 or 3 players off his chest and just run through, straight away, run through, pace and power, get himself through nice and easily. But now at the moment, the way it's, because of the changes, we're a little bit less fluid, so the passing's a little bit slower. By the time the ball arrives at Rashford, he's not able to time his run properly, which means that he's taking the ball slowly with players around him, which means that he's going to have to do something outrageous himself in those situations to get through, or he's going to have to stop and pass backwards, or he's going to lose possession. So the new dynamic is something that obviously there's not been enough training time to work on because we've been playing every 3 days. And I think over time, maybe we can get used to it, but at the moment, it's just not quite working in the way Ten Hag wants. And I think the difficulty is that Sancho suits that system a little bit better on the left than Rashford does. But if you put Rashford on the right, you lose what he's best at as well. So it's a strange situation where United are losing some of the best attributes that we had before, and we haven't really managed to gain it back. And that's, again, partly due to the condition we're in with the amount of games we've played. We're moving the ball slowly, we're a little bit lethargic, just not quite what we were doing before. And you can contrast Rashford's role in this to what you saw before. So if Sabitzer's Christian Eriksen here, pretend he's Christian Eriksen for now, what you often see on the left side is that we typically leave Luke Shaw a little bit deeper, or we tuck Luke Shaw into midfield, he can invert possibly, and that isolates Rashford 1v1. But the issue now is that because we can't progress play through the middle of the pitch with Scott McTominay there, we're having to progress play a lot more down the sides either side, which means that we have to keep Luke Shaw here. Now, obviously, what that means for the opposition winger is that he's going to stay here as well, which just, again, it congests the play a little bit more down that side. So it makes it that much harder, again, for Marcus Rashford to do what he's good at doing. And it makes us harder for us to isolate Rashford 1v1 in those situations. So, in terms of the way Fulham defended, and something United could have done a hell of a lot better, Fulham defended really, really narrow. So if Luke Shaw had the ball here, what you'd often see is the 4-4-2 would shift across really quite far. Very, very often it wasn't even sort of beyond the halfway point of the pitch widthways. And what that meant was that actually there's a lot of space on the opposite side, but we were so reluctant to switch the play at pace. And when we did switch the play, it was so slow and lethargic. It was, let's say we play a fullback to fullback switch, for example. The opposite side fullback every single time would take 3, 4, 5 touches, not really moving anywhere, not really changing the line of the ball, not really manipulating the defence in any way, to the point where it's just so easy for a Fulham team that haven't been playing anywhere near as many matches as United just to shift across as a team and stop us getting the ball forward. So again, it all comes back to the situation of the state we're in, where physically, United are nowhere near our best output because we've had to play so many matches. There's so much congestion physically, but also mentally as well. The mental fatigue is getting to the point where if you're Wan-Bissaka receiving the ball there, you're thinking, hang on, if I go on a sprint up here, knowing the situation we've got with the structure we've got in midfield, maybe Sabitzer's a little bit wider that side, Bruno's quite high. He knows there's just McTominay behind him, there's just Maguire covering a big space. So he's thinking mentally, I don't want to have to run back, I don't want to have to sprint back. I'm just going to be a little bit more conservative, just pass the ball, pass and move, try and pass our way through teams, rather than exploiting the space, rather than being really aggressive, which we've seen a lot more sort of closer to the start of this run where players were in better condition. So that's where it sort of hits in the pitch in terms of, yes, there's the physical fatigue of they can't necessarily do the runs, but actually at the moment it's probably more mental in the sense of they don't want to make the decisions that they were making earlier in the season because of the physical outputs. They're fearing that. And you can see that not just in the way that we play with the ball, but also the way we play without the ball. So what you typically see against opposition teams now is United play defensively in a 4-1-4-1 shape. So I'll just put Fulham back into their attacking structure in that 4-2-3-1. And what you'd see when United are sort of pressing whilst Fulham are playing out is United would set up in a 4-1-4-1. So you've got Weghorst up top. Behind that, you've got Fernandes, you've got Sabitzer, Sancho and Rashford. So as we've spoken about many times on the Tactical View, United's game plan out of possession is based heavily around 1v1 duels because it's those situations where if you can condense the game into 1v1 battles wherever possible, and your players can then win those 1v1 battles and they're able to get the ball forward after winning those, you've got a great chance of scoring within 2, 3 or 4 passes. So essentially what you're doing is, in as many different areas of the pitch as possible, you're creating transitional situations. So you're creating one battle there, you're creating one battle there. What you'll see as well is the fullbacks will be really high. You'll have Martinez high on Mitrovic, really aggressive, really tight. McTominay on top of Andreas Pereira. And the idea, as we've said, is that you create as many possible 1v1 matchups as you can. So the more 1v1 matchups you get, if this ball is passed into one of these players and it's not fizzed in at pace, then there's a high chance that Fernandes can nick it off Polina there, for example. And if he does nick it, the ball's going forwards, he's travelling forwards in that battle because he starts behind, but he's ready to jump, it's aggressive. So that's where you've got the game plan, the idea from Ten Hag of creating those 1v1 situations, but that's where you add the coaching element, what they practice in training on top. So they practice this in training to the point where they're good in 1v1 battles, they're able to read the situations, they know what sort of way the defender's going to go based on, the attacking player, Polina here, is going to go based on their movement, their body shape. They can see where it's going to go, and that's the practice they're doing in training, so that we get into these situations in matches, and when we're on top form, we're able to win those balls back in those situations and create transitions really quickly. So it's a way of, rather than traditionally, a lot of coaches, a lot of teams have thought of transitions as counter-attacking situations. So to have them, you've got to be defending deep, the opposition have got to give the ball away, you've got to win it back, but there'll be space in behind. Actually now, the game's evolved a little bit more to the point where it's not just those sorts of transitions, it's actually, you can get a lot of transitions in midfield by pressing in a man-to-man way. So rather than having the zonal approach where you'll all shift across slowly. There's no one's necessarily covering a man. It's all about covering space, where in that sort of situation, yes, you can win it back. You can transition slowly, but it's more about, the emphasis is more on stopping the opposition playing forward, stopping the opposition penetrating. Actually, instead, this is an aggressive game plan from Ten Hag, aggressive from United, and it's based around the transitions. But to do that, you've got to be in good enough condition physically and mentally that you can react quickly enough to the situations when that ball's going to drive in there. But also, you've got to be able to apply the basic fundamentals correctly. So what we saw quite a lot of times was when, for example, if the ball went out to Tim Ream, Weghorst would get across, but it's the last couple of steps. They're so important when you're pressing. Those last 2 or 3 yards. So the coaching points when you're pressing, what coaches are telling the players is get out as quickly as you can, shut them down, get as close to them as quick as you can. But in those last 3 or 4 yards, you've got to get yourself low, get yourself ready to intercept that ball, react to their movements quickly. And what we were seeing from United was that it was lazy. They were sprinting up until the last couple of yards, but then they were staying really high, sticking out a foot, and letting players go past too quickly. And what that means is, when you've got so many 1v1 battles set up, if somebody slips their marker or slips the man that's meant to be pressing them, everybody else is thrown into disarray and things start to break down. So you would see, for example, Weghorst would get there, but he'd be a little bit lazy. Maybe he wouldn't get he'd dive in and Tim Ream would get past him. Again, that's why it's so important to have a left-footed centre-back, because if he had to go back into the pressure, then the advantage of Weghorst diving in, he wouldn't be able to exploit that. Whereas being left-footed, he can just drive up the pitch, down the side, past Weghorst. And you saw it quite a lot of times with Polina as well, where up against Bruno, he was able to sort of react quick enough. Bruno was a little bit slow to get on top of him. He wasn't able to win the duels. Polina used his body quite well to sort of shield and turn. And what that meant was that he was able to carry the ball up the pitch. And as soon as that happens, there's disarray, because this guy's lost his duel, so he's out of the game. He's too high, he's out of the game. He's got to recover, somehow get back in. But it leaves McTominay with a decision to make. And if you've got Casemiro, you can trust that he's going to make the right decision a lot of times. You put someone of lesser quality, which I don't want to be mean to McTominay because I quite like him as a player. I think I respect what he gives on the pitch in terms of he always gives his all, even though he's not the best of players. I respect him, so I don't want to sort of go in too hard on him. But you put someone like that in comparison with Casemiro, and the decisions they make in terms of when to stick with their man and when to deal with the mess that is created by the whole thing being thrown into disarray, it's not going to be anywhere near as consistent. He's not going to get it right anywhere near as much. And what that means is you just end up getting exposed time after time after time. So what it is a situation where we're in at the moment where, as we've mentioned, because of the mental fatigue, we're not able to keep the ball as well, but also because of the physical fatigue on top of the mental fatigue, when we're defending at the moment, the 1v1 setup that is set to give us the best chance possible of nicking the ball back and scoring quickly on these mini transitions that we're creating is now meaning that we're even more exposed than we would be if we were defending space. And for me, that's the biggest thing that happened at Anfield last week, is where In after sort of 2 or 3-0, we probably should have just switched to defending space, because if you're not winning your battles in those 1v1 situations, you leave a lot of space out there on the pitch, and you leave a lot of players breaking into space whilst you're at the same time as your defensive structure being thrown into disarray. So you leave a lot of chances, a lot of opportunities for the opposition to exploit, to get down the sides, to get balls into the box, and that's the downside of this situation, of this system, this setup. And I think going forward, Ten Hag will want to have a bigger squad in terms of get to a point where he can rotate players without losing quality. I think at the moment, given it's his first season, he's having to play players through injury, through knocks, through them not being in their best form, just to keep the relationships intact, because you can't hope to build a good relationship with 18 players until you've done it with your first 11 to start with. And obviously with the big injuries we've had of late, it's tough. So the physical and mental fatigue is getting to a point now where this team it needs a break, desperately. These players need a break, and for me, I hope that over the international break, maybe we don't send some players on international duty. I know Varane's not going away, he's retired from France. I don't want players to be injured, but a minor knock that stops them going on international duty would be perfect. That's exactly what we need now. But going forward for the rest of this season, I think if we can get United back into top form, in Europe in particular, where players are less physical, even if we're not on it physically, even if we are a little bit physically fatigued, this sort of system still generates so many transitions for us. It still works so well. It's just in the Premier League where you've got more physical teams, more physical players. It doesn't work quite so well when you're a little bit fatigued. So, international break coming up. It's the perfect time for United to reset, regroup, and hopefully for the rest of the season, we've got 2 trophies left to win, Europa League and FA Cup. Let's do it. Cheers for watching today, guys. If you enjoyed it, let me know what you thought in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys again very soon.